Hello, my name is Ed Shikada. I'm Palo Alto City Manager, and welcome to our second Palo Alto Reads event. Palo Alto Reads is a one book, one community program put on by the Palo Alto Library and is part of the City of Palo Alto's Race and Equity initiatives. We're encouraging reading and discussion of selected book to foster our community conversations about themes and topics relevant to our city, exploring our city's history, warts and all, as the case may be, as well as current issues, a really important part of addressing ongoing inequities throughout our community and other communities and exploring solutions together. Today's program highlights Professor Jennifer Eberhardt's book, Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice that Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. So how do we talk about bias? How do we address racial disparities and inequities? What role do our institutions play in creating, maintaining, and magnifying those inequities? And what role do we play as individuals? These are a few of the questions that Professor Eberhardt will begin to address and discuss with us today. Dr. Eberhardt is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and recipient of a 2014 MacArthur Genius Grant. She has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and was named one of Foreign Policy 100 leading global thinkers. She is co-founder and co-director of SPARK, Social Psychological Answers to Real-World Questions, a Stanford Center that brings together researchers and practitioners to address significant social problems. Professor Eberhardt will be joined in conversation by Ralph Richard Banks, the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law at Stanford Law School and co-founder and faculty director at the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. Professor Banks has been a member of the Stanford faculty since 1998. Professor Banks teaches and writes about family law, employment discrimination law, and race and the law. We have quite the power couple with us this evening, so it is really my pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So again, thank you all for joining us today.
Wow. Whew. We should all take a breath here. Just take a break.
He's just saying that because he's my husband.
This is still, everybody's still in my thunder. I wanted to unveil that in the Q&A.
Oh.
Now, not only have I been married to Professor Eberhardt for many years now, but we've actually known each other for most of our lives, all of our adult lives, from when we were little children, our son's age, actually, when he was on the airplane almost. So, and who would have imagined, right, that we'd be here today in Palo Alto.
Yeah.
But it's great to have all of you here. We have a number of questions in the chat, too many to cover, no doubt, and there's so many issues here and it's so rich. But let's just start with this question of bias. And people typically think of, or sometimes think of bias as something that individuals have, that an individual is, racist or not. And then we also have a question about, what about levels of bias among African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino individuals? So could you speak to that question? What is bias? Is it something that individuals either are or are not?
So yeah, well, I refer to bias as the thoughts and feelings we have about social groups that can affect our decision-making and our actions, even when we're not aware of it. And so that's the definition I'm offering here. And, we're all susceptible to bias. And so it's not the case that, if you're in a certain group, you're never going to act on bias. If you're in another group, you are going to act on bias. Bias is not something that's just a permanent fixture in our heads and our brains, right? We have, a tendency towards bias. We have the potential to act on bias, but we're not acting acting on bias all the time, right? So it's something that's triggered by our situations, and we can manage bias by managing those situations. We can manage bias by managing the social environments we're in. And so if we're even in the workplace, for example, we can manage bias by controlling that environment, but through our policies and our practices and so forth. So it's something. I mean, I think we like to think about it as something either you are or you're not, but it's really something that we all have the potential to be, and our environment has a lot to say about that.
Okay, that's very useful. And you talked about reducing bias, and you ended by talking about the workplace. And most of us have a workplace, and that's something that's relevant to a lot of people. So can you give some other examples of companies you've worked with and their challenges, successes, failures in reducing bias with respect to their operations?
Yeah, so I've also worked with Airbnb a little bit. They also had a problem with racial profiling. Now the core mission of Airbnb is to open the world to people, to let users know that this is on their platform. Every community is a place where you can belong. That's their tagline. Yet when African Americans tried to book a place to stay, they were the most likely of all groups to be rejected by host. And so Airbnb tried to handle this on multiple fronts. And so they had hosts sign a pledge that they wouldn't discriminate. They improved the process for reporting discrimination. But the thing that I was drawn to was the fact that they set up a task force to use data to fight the problem. So they would invite researchers to join that task force. So this was a task force of data scientists who worked at Airbnb, but they would invite researchers in to join them to help them to figure this out. And so I was one of those researchers. I went there from time to time. And the cool thing is that, so the task force, they were able to actually reduce profiling. But the cool thing is that they're still in place. Right? They're constantly monitoring what's happening on the platform, trying to figure out ways to decrease bias. And so that's another example of somewhere else I've been, other than the police department, working with them.
And how about on the issue of reducing bias? What role might technology play in helping us to reduce bias? We're here in Silicon Valley, and people are often thinking of technological fixes.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about technological fixes to reduce or mitigate bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I think people, it's attractive to think that there is a technological fix, right? Because people don't want to think about bias. They don't want to think about race. And they feel like if we just hand this off to a machine, for example, we don't have to deal with it. We can remove the human person with bias from it, and we don't have to deal with it. But as we know, like the algorithms that are developed can have bias because they're based on data that's coming out, from the world, a world that's filled with racial disparities and inequalities and so forth. And so I feel like it's the wrong impulse to try to put on a machine what we should be dealing with ourselves. So I feel like we want to take more responsibility for bias rather than less. And so I reject that impulse. But at the same time, I don't feel like AI is evil or AI is bad. I feel like it's not inherently bad, right? It's something that if we use it in the right way can actually reveal a lot and help us with some of these issues we're facing. So for example, in Oakland, we've begun to use AI techniques to look at body-worn camera footage. And so we're using these machine learning techniques to comb through footage to understand how it is that officers speak to drivers doing routine traffic stops. And we're finding that even when officers are behaving professionally, like nothing jumps off, there's no escalation, there's no use of force, nothing happens really. Even in those situations, they're speaking to Black drivers with less respect than white drivers. And we found, in fact, that we can, use a sort of a simple computer model to determine, just based on the words officers are using alone, whether they're talking to a Black driver or a white driver. We can predict that with 80% accuracy. So I feel like, analyzing this footage could help us, a lot. I mean, I think that should be more a part of the story with police reform. I feel like, a lot of times, especially, due to George Floyd's killing, people feel like, oh, the cameras don't really make a difference. They're not doing anything. But I feel like we're not leveraging cameras in the way that we should. We could leverage them a lot more. I mean, the fact is that the vast majority of the footage that the cameras capture is not examined. It's not examined, by police departments. And part of this has to do with just the fact that it's just so much footage. How do you begin to comb through it? And so that's where I feel like the technology can help us.
All right. Well, let's stay with that for a minute, because there's a lot of conversation now about policing.
Yeah.
And we're at a point after all the events of this summer and last spring, many Americans have come to recognize the racism that is part of policing. And some trace this all the way back even to the slave patrols that were the origin of modern police forces in a sense. So how optimistic are you that policing can be reformed as opposed to it's simply irredeemably racist and needs to be deconstructed or defunded, as some activists would say?
Well, I believe in reform. That's why I've been spending time trying to to push reform, to make changes in Oakland and elsewhere, not just Oakland, also in Sacramento, also in San Francisco, also in New York. And I feel like, I've seen change, and so change is possible. I don't think that the public is always aware of the amount of change that happens within police departments. But there is, but they're tough problems. And so, I feel like we need solutions at all different levels. I'm talking to you about solutions or things that we've done with the cameras, or we've done with sort of changing the mindset of an officer doing a traffic stop. But there are lots of other things. I mean, changes to policies, for example, we need that. We need changes to enforcement practices. So I feel like change is definitely necessary, and we should look to all these different levels of change, including sort of changing the culture of policing.
Okay, and how do we well, let's stick with this issue of change, because a lot of people are concerned about these issues and want to try to change. There are lots of organizations that want to try to produce change within the organization. Can we talk for a minute about efforts at change or transformation or cultural, transformation that you think might not be successful? Are there certain things that people think, here's what you do if you have a DEI problem, or here's what you do if you have a race problem, and they actually don't work?
Yeah, I think one big one is this tendency to be colorblind. I feel like a lot of people in this country have grown up where, they're taught to be colorblind by their parents. They feel like that's the best thing to do. That's the best thing to be, because if you don't see color, you can't be biased. Right. So that's the idea behind it. But the research doesn't support that at all. So, for example, there's research done even with little kids, 4th and 5th graders, where they take some of the kids and they tell them, we all believe in racial equality. And so that's why we need to be colorblind. And they took another group of 4th and 5th graders and they tell them, we all believe in racial equality. And that's why we need to recognize and value our differences. And so then they expose these children, all of them, to this situation where a little boy knocks a black boy down on a soccer field. So the white boy knocks a black boy down and kicks him and punches him. And then they're asking, well, why did you do that? Why did you do this to this boy? And the kid says, because he's black. And black people are aggressive, and I thought he would punch me, so I punched him first, something like that. Right. So it's a sort of blatant discrimination here. Right. So you take these kids you take the kids, for example, who were, in this condition of the study where they were told, that we need to value our differences. And you ask them, is this a sign of discrimination? Is this an example of discrimination? The vast majority of them say yes, without a doubt. 100%, right? But if you look at the kids who were taught to be colorblind, only half of them see that, that issue as an issue of discrimination. Only half of them. And so when they're taught to not see color, they also don't see the discrimination that comes along with color. So if the whole idea of color blindness is so that we can address inequality, it's doing quite the opposite. Right. It's leading you to not see that inequality. And so therefore it could sort of remain and fester. In fact, when these children, these 4th and 5th graders told their teachers, they were asked to tell the story about what happened to your teacher. And when they told the story in a way where the teacher said it was no big deal, that this kid was punched and knocked down. They said they wouldn't intervene. Right after hearing the story about what happened from the kids who were colorblind. So I feel like, it's a big issue. There's other research showing that by the time children are 10 years old, they already know that you're not supposed to talk about race, that it's impolite, that it's taboo, right, to bring the subject up. And so then you get to be an adult and you're in the workplace, and we're wondering, like, why people are having problems talking about race. Like, why are we having problems having these conversations? And it's because we don't have these conversations. People spent their whole lives avoiding these conversations. But we need to have these conversations now to start to deal with some of this stuff.
Right. So how do we make it? So this is a nice paradoxical insight you have here, which is that the suppression of awareness of race might in fact lead to more race-based behavior, or make one blind to how race does matter, in fact. And so if the solution, though, is to talk about race, how do we get people to do that? Because people have such a deep fear of being viewed as racist or saying the wrong thing and so forth. So it's one thing to get people to talk about race. It's another thing to get people to talk about race honestly. How do we get the honest conversation to occur, especially, frankly, in a liberal place like Stanford, where people feel, so much that they want to say the right thing that they might, say things they don't really feel just because they think they're the right thing? How do we get past that impasse?
Tell them to cut it out. That's one way. But no, seriously, I don't know. I mean, I understand that. I hear that a lot, that people are uncomfortable. You can feel the discomfort, right, as they're trying to talk about it when they take the leap to go in that direction. And I feel like this is where the science can come in. Right, because it kind of takes the heat out of it a little bit, and it allows people to, have sort of these conversations in a way where they don't have to be so hyper focused on themselves and so defensive, and so that they can hear what's being said. And a lot of that, it has to do even with the definition we were talking about of what bias is. If you think bias is something that makes you a terrible, evil, immoral person, obviously it is threatened when somebody is saying you're biased. But if you're thinking bias is something that that can get triggered in these different situations, right, that we're vulnerable to in some way, then you can have a different conversation. You could say, hey, you could have that conversation about even changing aspects of the workplace, changing the workplace environment in ways where, you can make it less likely, that people are going to act on that bias. So the science helps us a lot, helps us understand how bias operates. And then it also gives us the language, right, to talk about bias. And it also gives us actions that we can take to deal with bias. I think a lot of this just has to do with the fact that people fear that they might be biased, they might be found out, right? And they feel like that's a permanent kind of thing, and it's a damning thing, and it's super threatening. I just conducted some research on this issue with Carol Dweck and some member of our department, psychology department at Stanford, and others. And we were looking at this issue with children. This idea that, when children think about prejudice as something that's fixed and you just can't get around it versus, children thinking that it's something that's malleable, you have a really different response. And the thing, again, about this is that when you think, we had a study where we told children that prejudice was either fixed or malleable. And when you look at the children who are in this condition of the study where they're thinking prejudice is fixed, they get nervous, and they just have a lot less desire to even engage with people of other races. And so they're less likely to, even want to engage in these interracial interactions. They're less likely to say that they want, friends of another race and so forth. So it has real consequences. It's like how our mindsets about bias, matter a lot for, how we engage with each other.
Wow. Okay. There's so much we could talk about here. One broad question that might cover all of the different domains you talked about is related to other groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, American Indians. How might bias relate or not to these other groups? Do the findings with African Americans translate neatly to these other groups, or are there important differences there?
Well, I mean, a lot of like what I talked about when I put up that slide about the triggers of bias. I mean, these are sort of triggers that we know about more generally. And so, like I said then, they're triggers that they don't depend on one specific group that's targeted by bias. So any group that's targeted by bias, you have to watch out for these, conditions under which bias is going to be more likely. The thing that differs, one thing that differs is just the social status, of the groups. Another thing that differs, the racial disparities, are sometimes different. Another thing that differs is just the stereotypes, the nature of the stereotypes about the groups. And so all those things can shift, but the process of stereotyping is similar across groups, but the content of the stereotypes would be different depending on the groups.
Okay, and can we take for those of us who were psychology majors undergrad, they learned a lot about the distinctions between cognitive processes on the one hand and emotional responses on the other. Can you say a bit about the interplay between cognitive and emotional?
Yeah, I mean, so both cognitive processes and our emotional states matter for bias. So if we don't have time to sit and think, and we're using our intuition that's kind of based on these associations, these cognitive associations that have built up over time, you're more likely to have bias affect your decision making. Bias can affect your actions. If we're fearful, if we're feeling threatened, these are emotional states. We're more likely to act on bias. A lot of, this is actually relevant to the policing context again. So in Oakland, this was well before I got there. They changed the police department changed their foot pursuit policy. So it used to be the case that they could chase somebody down the street, chase them into an alley, chase them into an enclosed backyard, a dark space, all of that, and that was fine. right? But then they changed the policy so that if you lost sight of the suspect, you had to stop the chase. So if they were in a backyard or in a house, you could set up a perimeter, but it slowed them down. It created space and time to try to think things through. And so then they're sort of thinking that the cognitive processes, kick in, right? So you're thinking, you're less afraid. The adrenaline rush is calming down a bit. So they found that when they before this change they made to the foot pursuit policy, they would have like 8 to 9 officer involved shootings a year, every single year. But after this change, they would have the same number of shootings in a 5-year period or a 6-year period, right? And also, so the issue is when you change the policy, you're also changing the mental state, of the officer. So they're not having to make a split-second decision in a dark, enclosed, a backyard. They're not having to try to figure out whether that was a gun or a cell phone. They're not, they're not feeling threatened and afraid, in the same way. They're able to, to tamp it down a bit so that they can sort of reason through and sort of think in a more methodical way about what to do. And because of this, so fewer community members are being hurt or shot at or killed, but also the officers themselves. Right, there was a 70% reduction in officers' injuries with that change in policy. So with a change in policy, you can also have a change in mental state that can really matter and can actually end up, mattering for, like, in these life or death situations.
Okay. Wow, I think we're running a bit short of time. We won't be able to address all the questions we might have, because this conversation could go on for many more years, no doubt. Let's talk a little bit about children.
Okay.
Because a lot of people wonder, it's difficult for adults to talk about race. It's also difficult for adults to talk about race with children.
Yeah.
And sometimes when children do raise issues related to how people appear differently, that leaves adults embarrassed and not knowing what to say. And so how and when should parents raise the issue of race with children, or how should they respond to racial observations that children might make?
Yeah, I think when they respond where it's they're nervous or they're embarrassed or they change the subject, that gives the child a sense that something's wrong. Like talking about race is wrong. And that's why we know that by the time children are 10 years old, they just stop bringing it up. Because they know that you're not even supposed to talk about it. So you don't want to do that. Like, I think you want to have these conversations with your children and have those conversations early. Even when it's hard to do. I'm also guilty of this. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, Rick, or not, but when Harlan, our youngest son, was in elementary school, the principal of the school asked me to come in to talk to all the children about my work. And this was in 2014. This was at a time when Michael Brown was killed and there were protests erupting all over the country. And I was doing work, on, police reform and doing all this stuff. And I'm like, whoa, I don't want to go there talking to little kids about my work. And I said, you do realize what I do? And he said, yeah. And I'm like, okay. Now, as a parent, most parents on the call will know when you're called upon by your school to do something, you're supposed to do it. So I was like, okay. I said I'd do it, but I wasn't happy about it. Also this was an all school assembly. And so I could imagine like talking to kindergartners about this and the parents, in the background giving me the evil eye. But something changed my mind. And that was when I was taking my son to school one morning, and I was listening to NPRs, listening to the radio, and they were talking about Freddie Gray. And he had just died in police custody in Baltimore. And they were covering all the different protests there and so forth. And so I'm listening to the news about the protests. And then I hear this small voice from the back seat of the car that kind of, sort of, shifted my attention away from the story. And he says, Mommy, why is Baltimore on fire? And I thought, wow, just because we're not talking to our children about race doesn't mean that we're shielding them from it, right? These are hard issues, and when we don't talk to them about the hard issues, we leave them all on their own to figure it out by themselves. And so we feel like we're shielding them and that we're protecting them, but we're leaving them even more vulnerable. And so I just really, in that moment, I changed my mind. I changed my attitude about going to the school, and I went there and I gave the talk, the all school assembly. I was asking questions. I put slides up of protests, and I asked the children, why do you think people are protesting? Every hand shot up in the auditorium. Even the kindergartners, they wanted in on that conversation. They wanted to talk about it. So we don't give our children enough credit, and we should have those conversations with them. And they want to have those conversations with us.
Yes, and sometimes children can be more forthright than adults.
That's true.
Better or for worse. So let's bring it to the local setting.
Okay.
When you've talked about these different domains, policing, education, the workplace, what about the municipal setting? What are the implications of this research and this awareness, this knowledge for cities like Palo Alto, say, who might be the cities that might be described as fairly progressive, but also extraordinarily affluent and historically not especially racially diverse?
Yeah, well, I feel like sort of research can.
Any issue you want there within the scope of Palo Alto.
Okay, I'm gonna go for Palo Alto.
Here we go.
Okay.
Another way to frame this is, what should Palo Alto be doing, or what should they be thinking about right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think about how is it, like, what kind of city Palo Alto wants to be. I think about all of the issues in Palo Alto, especially issues of racial disparities and so forth, and think about is it the case that those disparities are just there and you can't do anything and that's just the way the world is, or are there things you can do? Are there steps you can take? Are there things that you're doing that actually maintain those disparities? And so I would encourage you to add friction to your own processes as you think about these things, and to try to figure out, is there a role that you can play in addressing some of these issues? And I would also say to bring in researchers. I mean, there are researchers, lots of researchers right here, at Stanford that you could call upon. I feel like the research enterprise is about a belief in data. It's about a belief in pursuing solutions that are evidence-based. And I feel like also research forces us to challenge our intuitions about how the world operates. And sometimes we make a lot of decisions. We even create policies based on intuitions. And so I think the research is critical. I think research forces us to challenge our biases. It offers this possibility of a new narrative, right, for understanding things, and just allows us to imagine a different world. And so I would recommend that.
Okay, that is very good. The what about let's talk a little bit about your own journey here, if you will. Has your perspective changed over time? There's some research findings that maybe you've seen as high points, made you feel really good. Others that made you feel really bad. that were low points. So maybe could you talk about one or the other of those, either high points and findings, low points and findings, and then how has your view changed over time as you've had more experience in this space?
I mean, high points are points where it's an odd thing to say, but oftentimes as researchers, we have hypotheses about things, right? And we pursue those hypotheses, and we just look to see if the data, bears that out. And I think the highest points have been when I was wrong, or when something was more extreme than I thought. There's a moment at which I felt like I was understanding something about the world that I didn't before, and that I had I was situated in a way where I could share those findings with others. And so those are the high points. I think the low points I've tried to block out of my memory. So I'm blanking on that right now.
Are there any particular studies that were kind of hard to bear?
Yeah.
Maybe things you didn't talk about?
A lot of studies that have been hard to bear. Yeah. That death penalty study I talked about, that was hard to bear. Probably the hardest thing to bear was I used to do a lot of work on race and dehumanization. Mm-hmm. And that work kept me up at night. I had to put it aside for a minute. I still haven't gotten back to it, but those findings were really alarming to me. So we would do, I showed you studies, when I was presenting early on with the blurry image of the gun and all of that. And if you saw, if you were exposed to black faces beforehand, you would be able to pick out the gun, a lot sooner. So we did some of the same studies looking at dehumanization and looking at this Black Ape Association, actually. So this is an association that's one that has a lot of history that's centuries old, but we were finding that that association is still alive today. And so we would do a similar study where we would expose people to black faces and show them blurry images of various animals, and we found that if they saw the black faces beforehand, they were able to detect when we were showing them an outline drawing of an ape, for example. So that work, I did that work for a number of years, maybe 5 years or so, but I had to put it aside because it was one really depressing finding after another. And then I was also unsure about how do you address that when the bias is so deep and stuff that, we're carrying forward, right, from the 19th century, is still there with us. It's still in our minds, right, in some way. So that was depressing. I think more recently, I've been more hopeful about things. I feel like, this is a moment, especially in the last, several months, where the country is attending to these issues. They're really focused on it. There's a pause, there's friction, if you will, where people are rethinking things. And so that feels good. And that's affected my own work, because now I feel like I don't want to just study problems. I want to also offer solutions. And so I'm doing a lot more work that is more solutions oriented than I ever have before. And I'm starting to share that work more with the world rather than just with other researchers. And so that's a change too.
Okay. And the, I'm sorry, we have many apologies to all the questioners, people who put questions in the chat that we won't be able to get to. There are many great observations there.
Well, maybe you could save them, the organizers. I can look through them.
There are many great observations. But, so how is bias? You talk about bias being out in the culture and it being transmitted across time. How does that happen, though? How is it the case that children are kind of inheriting the views of their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents even? What's the mechanism of transmission there? And then how can we break that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. A lot of times people feel like, a lot of it's being transmitted through the media. through, television, movies, cartoons, even the books that children read are kind of coded with bias. So you're picking up all this information, even as you're learning to read about, how groups are valued in different ways. And so definitely picked up that way. But I feel like sometimes we don't recognize our own role in transmitting that bias. And so, and I feel like saying it's all the media, again, is a way to say it's not us. In the same way we talked about artificial intelligence, right? And saying, okay, let's let the algorithm take care of it. It's not us, but it is us too. Children pick up fear. They pick up, how we respond to different people in different ways. And they, children that's their job, right? They are really, really good at noticing what correlates with what. I can tell you one last story before we break. Is when one of our sons was just in first grade, he came to me and said, "Hey, mommy," he said, "do you think people feel a different kind of way about Black people?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "I don't know." He says, "I just feel like there's just something extra special there. There's this like something going on." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he says, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, why don't you think about it?" I said, "Think about the last time you felt that way and tell me about it." And so he thought and thought, and he says, "Okay, remember we were in Safeway last week?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, a Black guy came in." So this was a Safeway in a almost all white neighborhood. He says, "A Black guy came in and I noticed that people kind of stayed away from him a little bit." And he was really into Star Wars then. And so he says, it was almost like there was a giant force field around him, right? And he said, when this man stood in the line, he said his was the shortest line for a long time. And I said, well, what do you think that means? And he says, "I don't know." And he was thinking about it and he was thinking about it. And then he lifted his head up and he said, "I think it's fear." And I thought, wow, first grader, right? It wasn't watching the movies and all of this. It was looking at us. It was looking at how we move through the world and making calculations about like something is different and trying to figure out what that different. We didn't have to say Black people are treated like this. Black people are seen like this. Parents don't have to say, things that are biased or racist to their children. It's what's not said. It's looking at how we behave. And children are super perceptive at picking that up.
Okay, we're almost at the end of our time. So let's end, as we should during this very difficult period in our nation's history, on a point of hope and optimism. What is it that gives you hope and leaves you optimistic?
What gives me hope is that change is possible, that we see change every day. I mean, even with the killing of George Floyd, there were protests, but protests like we've never seen before that were, multiracial, across generations, across the world even, right? And so it was a moment of pause for everyone, not just African Americans, and a moment of pause where we're still talking about it, where the activity on the street actually reached the boardrooms, the activity on the street reached the schools, it could be felt everywhere. And so that gives me hope that, as a nation, we've been struggling with these issues for centuries, but people aren't giving up. Like people, are wanting to fight. So that gives me hope.
On that note, we will end. We are at our time.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
Wow.
much for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
This has been phenomenal. Let me just thank you. And if nothing else, Jennifer and Rick, if I could say thank you so much. You're demonstrating, Jennifer, I think your point that research, and hopefully, this is my hope, that tonight is an example of how this conversation will be one step in how your research can help impact policy and can help us as we take our steps forward as a community. Just that little community of Palo Alto and beyond, and for everyone who can watch this, clearly through the impact of your work. But also, let me just say, for the purpose of this conversation, This conversation has been amazing in terms of being so human, so relatable. Thank you so much. If this was the big reveal, then I am so proud that we got to be the platform for the big reveal, to have the power couple in action, and I suspect it won't be the last. So with that, let me just thank our partners in this event, City of Palo Alto, Palo Alto Library in particular, the Bill Lane Center, and the Center for Racial Justice. So on behalf of all those partners, again, thank you. And thank you for our audience. We did get up close to 700
Oh, wow.
attendees.
Over 700. And we should add finally, if people do have institutional problems related to race, they should feel free to email one of us, and we'll see if there's something that either or one of our organizations can do, or if we can otherwise mobilize and leverage the resources of Stanford.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
Andy.
We do want the university to be a service to the greater community.
That's right.
And to that point, let me just say that this is a wonderful example of that. And really thank you to Stanford University on behalf of the City of Palo Alto, because this is a tremendous example, but we've also had other examples where we are so blessed in Palo Alto to have the academic brainpower of Stanford University and all of your centers that have been doing such amazing work.